Hi, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Victor, are people still coming in or should we go ahead and get started?
We still have people coming in. They're trickling in now after that big
Okay,
wave. But I can keep letting people in if you want to get started. I think with 60 folks on the call, we've got
awesome.
good.
Fantastic. Um, Great. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. My name is Danielle Mueller. I'm the Sustainability and Resilience Manager for the City of Alameda and co-chair of the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee. Joined tonight with my co-chair, Keita Price, the HIP Planning Group. We're going to walk you through an introduction and then we'll introduce the rest of the team in just a moment. Next slide. Great. So tonight we'll do a little bit of an overview of this of our committee and our projects, go over some ground rules. I'll turn it over to our consultants to discuss our projects, and then we'll do a little bit of an introduction into climate science and some of the concepts that we're trying to address in these projects, and then talk about our effort to develop a long-term adaptation planning framework. And then we will be wrapped up by 7:30 tonight. Go to the next slide. So this workshop is hosted by the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee, and this is some of our members, many agencies, jurisdictions, and community partners that make up our committee. And you can just go on to the next slide, I think. The committee was formed in 2021 as a coalition of shoreline communities, agencies, and stakeholders working to coordinate flood and sea level rise adaptation projects to protect and restore water quality, habitat, and community resilience for the Oakland Alameda subregion. One of our priorities is to seek more funding. The City of Alameda will have an infrastructure bond on the ballot this upcoming November to help fund some sea level rise projects. This adaptation planning effort is also informing the city's hazard mitigation plan update. And we are seeking grant funding actively for these projects. Our consultant team we have with us tonight includes landscape architects, coastal scientists, coastal engineers, ecologists, biologists, civil and geotechnical engineers, and funding experts. We really have a multidisciplinary team addressing this project and all these projects and this challenge of sea level rise on our shoreline. So we're excited to share with you tonight some of the work that we have been developing. And first, I'm going to pass it on to co-chair Keita Price to talk about the community partners and discuss some input opportunities.
Hey, good looking, Danielle. Good evening, everybody. How you doing? Keita Price here. Yeah, so input opportunities for these projects we're talking about. The community partners are leading the community engagement effort for this project, and want to give a special thanks to Greenbelt Alliance, Ninth Root, the REAP Climate Center, Hood Planning Group, and CASA for teaming together to support the consultants with deeper community engagement. So this May 20th workshop is part of our first round of engagement. And today we really want to talk about like what sea level rise means for Oakland and Alameda, how sea level rise impacts groundwater in our stormwater systems, and general tools to make our communities more resilient and transformative. As we mentioned, we have a lot of different jurisdictional folks in this group, so we always thinking about these topics. And so in this meeting, we want to get your feedback on what I just mentioned, and also some of these ground rules on how we'll work together today. And so, in addition to this workshop, it will be more opportunities later. This is again round one. So in round two in July and early in next year, we'll be able to get deeper in our engagement. And it'll be more than just an introduction about the project, but you'll get to get more specific into giving feedback on, again, certain strategies for adaptation. And sorry, with that said, going to our ground rules, we want to ground ourselves in how we are working together today. We will have breakouts, and we want to make sure that everybody on the same page of how we are engaging with each other. So we just ask that you engage in active listening, seek first to understand, not to be understood. No one or two individuals should dominate the conversation. Our facilitators will be mindful, so please be respectful. Engage in your realm of experience and expertise, and respect and engage others in theirs. Take ownership for positive outcomes, and there's no bad ideas. Let's make this a yes and space. And now that we are grounded in the space and know how we want to interact with each other to maintain positivity, we wanted to open up with activity to first hear back from you all to learn more about you by learning where do you work, live, and play. So if you can add your responses into the chat, we'll generate a nice little, okay, Bay Farm, word cloud to show you all who all in the building. Alameda, keep it coming. You feel me? I'm East Oakland in the building. Crab Cove, Alameda. I went to Encinal, the Bay. East Oakland, yes, let's go. Keep it going. East End, Alameda. Alameda deep in here. Okay, Berkeley. Let's go. Okay, Alameda, they winning. Let's go, Harbor Bay. Okay, yes. Thank you all for it, man. Keep it going, Bay Farm. All right, Jack London, San Mateo. Welcome. Let's go. Hey, anyone else? Anyone else? Thank y'all for participating. Living, working by the lagoon. Where the lagoon at? Sorry, I'm not familiar, but nice. Old Oakland. Yes, I live, work, and play in the East, all over the Bay. Nice. Okay, cool. Jack London, work, old Oakland. So it looked like our responses are slowing down a bit. Yeah, thank you all for participating. Again, want to just get a little bit more familiar with you all, and for you to get comfortable with giving your feedback. Because throughout this workshop, again, we'll have breakouts and different activities so where that we really want to hear from you to better understand, again, who's all in the room with us and what your focus is. So thank you. And now we want to transition, and I want to go ahead and throw it to our consultant, one of our consultants from the CMG team, Jamie Phillips, one of the principals. Jamie's going to talk more about sea level rise and help us understand sea level rise and how we can rise up with the rising seas. So, Jamie, it's all you.
Thank you, Keita. Thanks, everybody, for telling us where you live, work, and play. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to introduce the projects to you all that we're engaged in, starting with this historic map of the Oakland Alameda shoreline from 1895. The shoreline for Oakland and Alameda has been in a state of change for thousands of years before, but then humans came along and we've been involved in a series of dramatic transformations along the shoreline as well for the past 150 years. And so, here you can see that Alameda was actually a peninsula that was connected to Oakland near where today's Park Street Bridge is. And then portions of Oakland and the airport were tidal marsh. And Bayfront Island was truly an island, whereas today it's actually a peninsula connected to Oakland. So next slide. And then since 1969, about 75 years later, you can see that the land has been changed dramatically. And next slide. And specifically, the tidal flats and tidal marsh, the slide on the left, the brown represents tidal flats, the green on the left is representing tidal marsh. Those have been filled and transformed and developed to what you see on the slide on the right. Most of that purple area is formerly tidal marsh that has been developed with neighborhoods and businesses, the port, and then Alameda Point. And so those areas where it's shown as purple in this map on the right is where that flooding in the future from sea level rise is going to be the most impactful in the region. Next slide. So the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee has been formed for over 2 years, and through their work together, they established a series of goals for the sub-region. And then as these projects got started in the fall, we adopted those goals into the charter for what we are going to explore in these projects. And so the goals are charging us all with protecting Oakland and Alameda subregion from the negative effects of expected sea level rise, inland flooding, rising groundwater, and liquefaction. The projects are going to identify and develop opportunities for multi-benefit adaptation strategies. Collectively, we'll avoid negatively affecting neighboring subregions through our protection and adaptation measures. And we will use an adaptation pathways approach to address the different sea level rise thresholds and time horizons and identify near, mid, and long-term adaptation strategies. We'll enhance the transportation, recreation corridors, bay access, and the San Francisco Bay Trail through these adaptation projects. And we will look to preserve and increase open space where possible. And we will look to improve the subtidal, intertidal, transitional, and upland habitat with nature-based solutions and improve air quality. So these were all the goals that were put together by the Oakland Adaptation Committee. And through what we talk about tonight in the presentation, these goals will show up over and over, and you'll see like the direction that the projects are going in. Next slide. So there are 3 projects that are currently funded and that this team is working on. And as Danielle mentioned, the Oak will continue to seek funding opportunities for ongoing adaptation projects. So the overall project is called the Subregional Long-Term Adaptation Project, and it is addressing the entire subregion from the Bay Bridge along the Oakland shoreline, all the way around the shoreline of Alameda, through San Leandro Bay, and then around the airport and Bayfront Island, with some portions of San Leandro in the subregion as well. The next slide. The second funded project is on Bayfront Island. It's a near-term project to address risk to sea level rise today that is located down at Veterans Court at the bridge, and then at a lagoon outfall and pump station there on the northern edge of Bayfront Island. This project will look at a near-term solution for these areas because they're at risk at flooding with today's king tide. And this project will also develop a long-range adaptation plan for Bayfront Island, the area shown in yellow. Next slide. And then the third project we're calling is the Oakland Alameda Estuary Project. It's addressing the shoreline on both sides of the estuary. On the Oakland side, from Jefferson Street near Howard Terminal, along the shoreline, all the way down to Lake Merritt Channel, over to the 880. And then on the Alameda side, from Boholz Immigrant Park, all the way down to Marina Village at the shoreline. And then the area in yellow is the watershed that's protected by the shoreline adaptation. And then next slide. Just to make this little piece of Alameda super clear to everyone, because this is something that affects the entire region, not just Alameda. There's a low point on the shoreline here near the houseboat community at Barnhill Marina so water can overtop that shoreline now at today's king tide. And then there's this low point where it can flow along inland, and then it can turn and go down into the Posey Tube. So the Posey Tube is at risk of flooding today due to sea level rise at that shoreline edge. Next slide. And so for this project, we're using these terms near term and long term. So the way that we're defining those are listed here. A near term project means a project that we need to address and solve in the near term, and the near term is by 2080. So within the next 35 to 50 years, we need to address the near term projects. That has a relationship to an estimate of 2 feet of sea level rise. And the elevation that we will be looking to protect to is elevation 14. That's a design criteria that we are using to study these adaptation projects. And then when we say long-term, long-term wants to build on the near term, but long-term is also beyond 2100. We have a little bit longer to solve long-term projects, but long-term projects should address 5 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And then next slide. And we are in the beginning of the projects. We have about 2 years to do the projects, and we are also at the beginning of engagement with you all. This is our first engagement workshop today. We're talking about climate science and the analysis we've done on the projects now. We'll come back to you all in this late summer and early fall to talk about early alternatives as we're trying to solve the near-term adaptation projects. And then there are different timelines for the different projects because of grant funding, but we'll also be back in the spring for another round of engagement, primarily on the long-term plan. So they'll shift, but we'll keep you guys updated, and we'll want to check in with you all the way through the process. The next slide. Okay, great. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Chris May. And I just want to let you all know that through this part of the presentation, part 1, climate science, Chris May is going to be sharing a lot of awesome, cool things with us. And I want you to feel free to ask questions as they occur to you in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. And then Chris May and I will answer the questions at specific points through the presentation. So we'll basically be doing 3 topics. It'll be about 20 minutes of talking, but we'll stop in the middle and answer questions as I collect them from the chat. Okay, thanks.
Thanks,
Chris.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Chris May, and I'm with the Pathways Climate Institute. And now, of course, it's my turn to talk. My slides don't want to advance for me, huh?
Mm-hmm. That's how it is.
I know. It's terrible. There we go.
Okay.
Right. So our climate is changing, and hopefully everybody understands that. It's changing, and it's changing faster than we really thought it would. So to be honest, if you take home one key message from everything I say in the next 20 minutes, it's really that our planet is changing. Our planet is getting warmer, and this is changing how our climate systems function, and things are changing faster than we as climate scientists thought it would. Mother Nature is always full of surprises, and climate change is really changing everything. We are operating under a new rule book, and we don't know all the rules. So this is a graph of global temperatures since pre-industrial times. So this just shows you how much global temperatures have risen over the past 140 years. Temperatures have risen steadily since 1970, and the world has changed immensely since 1970. I know Jamie showed you how much it's changed since the late 1800s, but even since, over my lifetime, I mean, I thought we would have flying cars by now, but we've still gone leaps and bounds ahead of where things were in 1970. And 2023 was the hottest year on record. We were actually in a little bit of a cool bubble here in the Bay Area, but we're not always going to have that cool bubble. I mean, extreme temperatures dominated the news all over the entire world. But not only was 2023 the hottest year on record, the last 10 years are the 10 hottest years on record. And this is the first year this has happened, that it's kind of like we don't have any years from the early 2000s or 1990s. It's just steadily gotten hotter, which is frightening. And right now, 2024 is looking like it, is going to be on par with this type of temperature changes. So the rising temperatures, they're impacting everything about our climate. So for this project, our goal is to increase resilience to flooding. And this really requires us to look at the entire water cycle. That's why I'm not just going to be talking to you about sea level rise and coastal flooding. I want to talk about precipitation. I want to talk about rising groundwater, because we need to look at all of the sources of flooding. Sea level rise is increasing coastal flooding from the bay, increased precipitation. Think about those winter rainstorms that hit us in 2023. Those storms are getting bigger, and that groundwater table is rising right beneath our feet, beneath our homes, and beneath our communities. So first, I'm going to talk a little about sea level rise, and then we'll pause at the end of sea level rise to see if anyone has any sea level rise or coastal flooding related questions before we dive into inland flooding and rising groundwater. So put those questions in the chat if you have any. I can't see the chat, so you can just type away. So what is sea level rise? Really basic, taking us back to some like 8th grade science maybe. But as the world gets warmer, sea levels are increasing because the total volume of water in the ocean is increasing. And that's happening because of two processes. One, as our global temperatures increase, that ocean water is expanding, and that is raising the surface of the ocean and the bay. And then the other thing is that glaciers and polar ice sheets, they are melting, so that ice that was on land is melting and going into the ocean, and that is also increasing the volume of ocean water. So this shows you that rising sea level, going back to nearly 1850, we are so lucky that we have this Presidio tide gauge at San Francisco Bay, that someone thought it would be a good idea to start collecting these observations back in 1850. I mean, it blows my mind that someone did that. And we have some of the precipitation data that goes back almost to the same time period, which makes it like really awesome to work here if you're into geeking out on this stuff. But you can see that the sea level has really steadily risen on average over this past 140 years. It goes up and down with cycles and El Nino years, but you can see that trend in rising levels. And it's going to keep on rising, but we don't know how fast it is going to rise in the future. There remains a huge amount of uncertainty related to how fast the sea level rise, how fast they could rise over the next 100 years or so. And based on the latest science from both the International Panel or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and our own US federal government, we often look at this range of 5 sea level rise scenarios that kind of consider a low trend, kind of extending historical trends, and then going up to a very high trend where we get that 6.6 feet of sea level rise at 2100. And that's really considering, continued very high emissions and also much faster melting of the glaciers. we don't know exactly where we are going to fall in these projections. So at 2050, it doesn't look so like it's a smaller range to plan for. You know, we're looking at like, you know, 1.5 foot of sea level rise. But when you look out to 2100, it's a lot more challenging. And we'll talk later about adaptation pathways that we're going to use to address that. So one thing that's really cool in the latest science that's come out of our federal government is they have taken this national data and they have developed sea level rise curves that are very specific to different regions of the US. So they are using 50 years worth of satellite observations along with the tide gauge data, not just at San Francisco Bay, but all along the coast, to look at, based on past trends, what is our most likely observation-based extrapolation, which probably I'm getting beyond 8th grade science, so it's okay if you don't understand everything. But what this shows us is that along the California coast, we're currently trending along the intermediate sea level rise curve. So that's my little presentation doohickey, if that's gonna work. We're trending along the one that's all the way in the middle. So that puts us at about 9 to 12 inches by 2050. And that helps us know what's the minimum sea level rise that we should really plan for. This is where we're trending based on historical records. And they didn't extend this past 2050 because we know things are going to change with the ice sheets and the glaciers. And we also don't know what people are going to do. So there's a lot of uncertainty still past 2050. So when we look at future sea level rise uncertainty, I like to break it down into like 2 things that are the greatest things of uncertainty, especially beyond 2050. Number one, it's us. It's humans. We're the ones that have caused this change, and global human behavior is what is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate climate change and help us go to one of these lower ends of the curve. It's up to every single individual, me and you, our collective communities, our national interests, our global, like every single action counts. And so it's really up to us whether we stay on the intermediate path or whether we can reduce emissions and reduce that rate of sea level rise. The other source of uncertainty is what is going to happen to the ice sheets and that marine ice sheet melting. And so it's really those low confidence processes. We're still learning the science, but the most uncertain part of the science is the low confidence processes related to the ice sheets. And those are what's going to drive us onto these 2 higher curves where we could end up with 6.6 feet of sea level rise. And we can observe around Alameda, around the bay, just how high sea levels rise have already come. People like to say we've had 8 inches of sea level rise in the past 100 years. No, we had 8 inches of sea level rise between 1900 and 2000, but we still use that statistic, which is sad because it's now 2025 and sea level rise have continued to rise. So we have had like more than 8 inches since 1900. We're going to have, you know, 9 to 12 inches by 2050, and we're already about like 4 to 5 inches on that trajectory. So sea level rise are rising, and it's really been observed along our shorelines. So this is along Harbor Bay Club, by the tennis courts near Veterans Court. This is over by Embarcadero West Bridge, over by Lake Merritt Channel, and this is like a rail bridge. So technically, water should be able to go under that bridge, but this is so high that it doesn't really look like a rail bridge. So as part of here is we have to design flood elevation targets of what we're trying to protect to, so or design to. So just to explain some of how we look at this is using a section at Northern Bay Farm Island as an example. The blue side is the bay. So you can see the elevation of the current high tide is down there at about 6.5. So we're looking at NAVD 88. My screen just went to sleep, so hopefully it didn't go to sleep for you. Did my screen go to sleep for you, or are you guys okay?
No, it just advanced 2 slides.
Oh, it did?
Or there.
There we
right.
go. All right. Where am I? All right. We have the current high tide, and then we've got that 1% annual chance high tide, like 100-year storm, that brings us up to 10 feet. So you can see on the left, those are the ground elevations. And if our lowest ground elevation is below that existing 1%, like those areas could flood today. So some of those areas are like around Veterans Court and the lagoon, like Jamie noted earlier. But the average ground elevation is not exceeded by that 1% annual extreme tide. But if we add 2 feet of sea level rise, that's going to put that water elevation exceeding a lot of that ground, the average. And then if we add another 3 feet, so it's getting to that 5 feet of sea level rise, that long term, the water level really along that entire stretch of Northern Bay Farm has now been exceeded during a 100-year event. So this is why we want to like add protection, figure out how we're going to adapt to this, or we're all going to get a lot more comfortable getting wet. So this kind of shows you that flooding is likely today, flooding that is likely by 2080, and flooding that is possible, but there's a low confidence of it by 2080. Because ideally, we are going to get our act together and we're not going to be on the very high end of sea level rise projections, but sea levels will continue to rise. That's why we want to look at those higher end projections. Another way to look at it is like, if we just look at 5 feet of sea level rise without really considering the 100-year storm, everything below 11.5 feet here is likely to flood every single day. And everything above that is likely to flood during a storm event with a recurrence interval of maybe 5 years, 10 years, 100 years. And this is kind of another way to visualize it along our shoreline. I'm not sure if this is exactly scaled correctly, because I think a lot of people's legs are longer than 2 feet. But you look at perspective. You can see at elevation 10, this is where 100-year extreme tide is. So here it is overtopping the shoreline. Then if you add 24 inches of sea level rise, it's going to be hitting a lot of these people in the waist. With another foot of sea level rise to get us to 36, it's hitting a lot of people at their shoulders or chests. And this can give you an idea, if you're building like a wall here, how high it would be. And this shoreline is very kind of indicative of a lot of the areas we have around Oakland Alameda, with very low lying shorelines and inland topography that is relatively flat. So this is what that coastal flood risk looks like. If this is our city today, and the bay is getting higher, rising sea levels are going to cause like more frequent flooding, and it's going to impact our shorelines, our parks, our buildings, our structures. And this is what we're looking at all around our shorelines. And I will pause there to see if anyone has asked any questions in the chat.
Yeah, lots of questions. I think that, so some of the questions are about the 2 feet prediction by 2080, and, you know, thinking about the other scenarios that are actually showing much higher levels of sea level rise again at that time. So can you talk through that a little bit more about why you're choosing the 2 feet by 2080?
Yeah, sure. Let's go back to maybe this one. So we know that things are currently trending on that intermediate curve. And so on that intermediate curve, which is this one that hits you to, I don't know if you can see my cursor on my screen because my screen went blank. So I don't know.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Yeah, so we're getting about 2 feet of sea level rise by 2080 on that kind of likely curve trajectory that we're on. So that's what we are planning for, designing for. But the team is also building in the ability to look at how we would adapt to like that additional 3 feet of sea level rise, so that if sea level rise starts trending faster than we anticipated, we have that ability to adapt to a higher rate of sea level rise. Either before 2080, we can trigger the design and implementation of that adaptation. And if we don't need it before 2080, it's something that we will be probably needing, you know, after 2080, after 2100, as sea level rise continue to rise. Planning right away for 5 feet of sea level rise leads to like pretty large scale changes along our shoreline. And sea level rise is like slow and chronic. And there are like, if we have the ability to adapt, it is easier to adapt slowly over time. And that really also gives us primarily a way to adapt with nature-based solutions, because natural shorelines, marshes are slow to adapt and slow to respond to a lot of these changes. And so I think the emphasis we want to have on nature-based solutions really lends itself to an adaptation pathways to do incremental steps over time.
Great. And we can talk more about that in the breakout sessions later. There was a lot of questions about that, but I think you answered that for now. There's a question about, so when we were saying in your elevation rulers, if we are planning for 2 or +3, or if we're planning for 2 feet of sea level rise, why would we be building our protection at elevation 14?
So that's a really good question. So current federal standards for flood protection requires that we add an additional 2 feet of freeboard. So it's kind of 2 feet above the 1% annual chance extreme tide is what FEMA requires, so that we can get our structures accredited. We can remove people from the floodplain so homeowners don't have to continue paying flood insurance. But we want to make these projects eligible for grant funding through, like, FEMA has a Building Resilient Communities and Infrastructure grant. And to be really eligible for that funding, we need to do an additional 2 feet of sea level rise. So that's what gets us to building today to 14 feet. We don't know over the really long term, like by 2080, if we're still going to have FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. So we don't know if we will still need that 2 feet of freeboard. That freeboard is really intended to account for the fact that our calculations of the 100-year flood are not exact. Our topographic data that we have for the ground elevations is not exact. You know, there's a lot of uncertainties in all of the measurements. And so that's why FEMA adopted that freeboard. But at present time, it's really important that we include that 2 feet of freeboard plus the 2 feet of sea level rise. It just gives us that extra safety cushion in the near term.
Okay, great. So there's a question that is, what impact do we have with climate mitigation efforts on the rest of the Bay Area?
What climate? Well, I don't know that we have a climate, well, climate mitigation is really more focused on reducing greenhouse gases. So every action that every community and every person does to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is going to make a difference to how fast sea levels rise and how fast temperatures rise. And that's really important for me, because I hear a lot of people say my actions don't matter. So it doesn't matter if I like recycle or, you know, conserve water or drive less. All of those actions matter. But then there's also perhaps the question is more about, like, if we build structures here, if we design adaptation, is that going to have an impact on the rest of the Bay? And it could, and that would be something that we need to look at, you know, as we get farther along in adaptation strategies. Because yes, what we do here mitigation-wise impacts everyone on the planet. What we do adaptation-wise could impact other jurisdictions around the Bay Area and how it impacts, like, Bay hydrodynamics, tides, and wave hazards.
So on your curve of likelihood of about how much sea level rise is going to happen by when, so if the Antarctic ice sheets melt, which curve would we be on?
If the Antarctic ice sheets melt at a rapid rate, then we would either be on the intermediate high to high rate. So those are the ones that would put us at 2100, you know, above, you know, 5 feet of sea level rise by 2100. It could be up to, you know, over 7 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Yeah, those are what's driven by those low confidence processes could drive us to be on one of the higher curves. And that's one of the reasons why we're planning right now for the likely, but we're building in the ability to adapt to those higher curves in the event that that is what transpires.
Great. Do I have a timekeeper in this group? How are we doing on time?
And we do need to move on.
Okay, great.
Let's talk about some other sources of flooding and see if we can get some other questions. Because I do want to talk about inland flooding, because we can't just address sea level rise and coastal flooding. If we only look at sea level rise and coastal flooding, we're still going to flood. Remember I said that rising temperatures impact the entire water cycle, and it does. And that's why it's really important that we look at precipitation-based flooding, and we also look at rising groundwater, because we don't want to just build a wall around our communities and unintentionally create like this bathtub situation that it's just going to fill with water and we're going to flood anyway. So the intensity of rainfall events is increasing. Like as our climate warms, these storms are getting bigger, they carry more rain. And my team at Pathways completed this regional climate modeling study with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, some of the leaders in climate science in the world, to better understand how rainstorms that impact the Bay Area would change in a warmer world. So this is really important for when we're looking at our stormwater analysis, because most design of stormwater systems relies on historical measurements of precipitation. It relies on a product that's called NOAA Atlas 14. That's kind of written into regulatory code. So it's like what everybody uses. And everybody's waiting for Atlas 15 to come out, but it's not out. And we cannot continue to plan for adaptation without understanding how precipitation is going to change. So what this graph here shows you, if we just look at 2050, that 100-year, 24-hour rainfall event could produce 22% more rainfall than a historical storm in like the year 2000. We released this study. We finished it up at the end of 2022. And then the biggest rainstorm that this area had seen in like 100 years happened on New Year's Eve, which I was really excited about. But I get excited about flooding and disasters and damage. And I know that's probably not very polite of me to get excited about it. But those storms really validated this study, because those storms were so intense and they really fell in line with like this analysis. And so as we are designing sea level rise adaptation, we need to consider the amount of rainfall that's going to fall on our cities, and how we get that water out of our communities through our stormwater systems. Unfortunately, many cities, including Alameda and Oakland, we use these gravity-driven stormwater systems to capture rainfall runoff and convey it out to the bay. Some areas will capture it and treat it, but a lot of this is just conveyed straight out to the bay, either by gravity or with pumps. And most of these stormwater systems are designed to carry those historical storm events. Like we'll often put the 10-year, 24-hour event in pipes underground, our sewer systems. And then that 100-year event is intended to be conveyed within the streets, like within the curb to curb line, ideally not damaging our buildings and facilities. So roadways are intended to be flooded, perhaps not this badly. You can see in 880 in Oakland in 2019 had some significant flooding. And then this other is a picture that I took just up the street. There was a pump station that failed that resulted in some significant flooding on the east end of Alameda. And so all of our flooding, the flooding can happen for so many reasons. It can happen because we have clogged catch basins, so the water can't drain in there. It can happen because the flooding actually took a pump station out of service and it can't do its job, so the flooding gets worse. Or it can happen because these systems can't drain out to the bay. or the storms are just too big. And so, yeah, getting the stormwater picture right and looking at where we can store this stormwater is really important part of planning for overall resilience. And I want to just highlight that some of our city's heroes that go very unrecognized are like the guys in these like little outfits, their bright neon colors, that are out there in the middle of floods, trying to unclog storm drains, trying to bring stormwater pump stations in order to prevent people from, you know, drowning and getting stuck and lost in the flooding. Much of our infrastructure is aging and in need of repairs, and pretty much in every flood, you see these guys out here, I'd say rain or shine. It's always raining 24 hours a day, trying to get us all moving again. But this, you know, we have a challenging feedback loop that all of these repetitive flooding events are actually aging the infrastructure more, and it's creating a big challenge for us with climate change. So rising groundwater is another kind of thing that we have to deal with. And rising groundwater is related to both precipitation and also to the bay. So all of that rain that is falling on the land, where it can get through, I mean, we have a lot of paved areas, but that rain, where it can get through, it's infiltrating through the ground and getting into this layer that's like an unconfined shallow aquifer. So that rainfall is raising the groundwater table. And then as sea level rises on the bay side, it's also raising that shallow groundwater table. So this groundwater flows very, very, very slowly through the soil. So when we get tons of rain, it can stay, the groundwater table can stay elevated in the low-lying areas near the shoreline for like many, many months. And it also makes it so that in the second storm or the third storm or the 13th storm, as we saw in 2023, the ground was totally saturated and had no capacity to like take any more groundwater, like no more infiltration. It just caused like direct runoff and flooding. So we have to consider the groundwater table, how much it can absorb, how much can its rise with sea level rise in related to precipitation. These are all very, very connected. And we saw that in 2013 when subsequent storms made localized flooding occur like much faster, or smaller storms that we would not expect to cause flooding, they resulted in flooding simply because the ground was saturated. So I'm talking about groundwater and I haven't really told you what it is. And I've learned like I should ask people if they know what groundwater is. But I've been really excited that I talked about this in East Oakland, and I was explaining that it's the groundwater, like it's underground. It's when you get to that saturated layer, this water is stored between all these like soil particles. So often we have an unsaturated zone where it's not wet. And if you dig down deep enough in your backyard, you should get to where the groundwater is saturated. And then if you keep digging, you'll end up having this hole that's just filled up with water. And there was this guy at a presentation that I gave in East Oakland that was just like, I just don't know. But then he went out planting some trees and like dug down, and he was really excited to like send me a picture and was like, I totally got it. And the groundwater table in my backyard is really high. And now I'm very concerned. And what are we going to do about it? So if you're not sure, just go dig a hole in your backyard. Really, I live in Alameda and I see the groundwater coming into my basement. I know it's there. So this is kind of an illustration of how sea level rise is also increasing the groundwater table. So it's not just driven by precipitation, but that fresh groundwater lens is connected to the bay. And so as sea level rise increases, it's actually pushing that freshwater lens up higher. And as that freshwater lens goes higher, it's increasing infiltration into our sewer pipes, decreasing their capacity to help us during storms. It can also start damaging roadways from below, reducing capacity in tributaries. And as it rises even farther, that groundwater table can push above the ground. This is actually what happens all the time, and it's in the areas where we have wetlands, but areas where we have infrastructure and buildings and parks and roadways are going to want to convert into wetlands simply because the groundwater table is going to be so high, and it's going to want to have ponding above the ground surface for large portions of the year. Areas that have been historically dry would really love to turn back to wetlands if we removed our structures from places that we like to live, work, and play today. So rising groundwater, it's below our feet. So it is going to damage infrastructure long before it rises above the surface. That's what makes it really hard, because we can't see the damage that's happening to our sewer systems, to our roadways, to our foundations, but it can happen. And the low-lying areas near the bay shore built on fill are really at the greatest risk of all of these sources of flooding, which is what Jamie was showing relative to those historic baylands that we filled. That's where we're going to have the sea level rise driven coastal flooding. That's where we have the biggest rainfall driven flooding. And that is also where we're going to have this challenge of rising and emergent groundwater. So my other key take home message for you, if you remember what the first one was, or two, is that water is the most powerful substance on Earth. In my opinion, I know people like diamonds, but I think it's water. Water is powerful. It's stronger than concrete and steel because water can morph itself into any shape. It can flow through even the densest materials given time. And it can be relentless in its repeating damaging potential. And so climate change and rising temperatures, they're impacting this entire water cycle. And that's why we want to develop plans that adapt to these changes, not just sea level rise, but looking at precipitation and looking at rising groundwater, which may change how we think about adapting our communities. And with that, we can pause again for some questions.
Yeah. Let's see. So everybody feel free to ask questions like specific to inland flooding, like the stormwater system and the groundwater flooding or rising groundwater, as we also talk about it. I don't have a specific question about that yet, so I'm going to try to back up and ask one of the other questions that came up. There was a question about whether the Port of Oakland and the and Alameda Point are included in the project area, and yes, they both are included in the sub-regional long-term adaptation plan project because that's taking on the whole region. And the Port of Oakland is a stakeholder that's a part of the Oakland Alameda Adaptation Committee. And then Alameda Point, the redevelopment plan does have a plan for sea level rise now as part of the redevelopment project. So as they can continue to develop that, they would work with the guidance that is the research that this project is doing also and coordinate with that. Okay. Also, I do want to note about Bay Farm and the airport. Yes, people are noting that the airport at Oakland is very low. It's previously tidal wetland, and it does need to be able to adapt both to the shoreline flooding as well as the inland flooding and rising groundwater.
Yeah, there are areas on the Oakland airport that uses pump stations today kind of to deal with the high groundwater table, specifically during like rainfall events. So yeah. And if you can remember back to the modern baylands graphic that Jamie showed, some of our modern baylands wetland habitat is surrounding the runways on the Oakland International Airport. So some additional challenges for adaptation.
And then I'll just mention that, yeah, it's on the near-term projects, at least that the funded projects now on Estuary project at Alameda and the project at Bay Farm Island, yes, they are absolutely addressing the near-term risk that is there right now on the northern shoreline of Bay Farm and the shoreline of Alameda. So that's well before the 2080. Those projects are aware that the the king tides are very high. Our shoreline is very low. The king tides are where they are.
And that project along the Northern Bay Farm shoreline will also be addressing the ongoing erosion that has been occurring, which is why it's not just Veterans Court and the lagoon. The line was along, that Northern Bay Farm stretch as well, to help do some nature-based solutions or other features to help address that ongoing erosion that I know a lot of people have expressed concern about.
Mm-hmm. As well as Doolittle Drive.
And yep.
Okay, and then a question of how does one address the groundwater rise, and do any of the projects address that?
We are looking at ways to address the groundwater rise. It's often dealt with by pump stations, which could be, very energy intensive, depending on what type of infrastructure is available in the future, probably more solar and renewable fuel source pump stations. But there's also ways to build kind of permeable collection boxes underground to try and catch the groundwater and pump it out and treat it in places where it might be in contaminated areas. And then amazingly enough, the lagoon systems of Alameda are amazingly effective at helping to depress groundwater levels. And so they might need to have larger pumps installed so that they can keep the lagoon at the elevations like they are today. It's going to want to go up. But if we increase the pumping and kind of keep the lagoon levels lower, that will also help deal with the lagoon, the groundwater table in a bit of a more holistic way. It's still using a pump station, but it would affect like a much larger area, like the length of those whole lagoons and some space around it. But I think exactly how effective all of these strategies are, we're still in the concept phase. So we haven't done any kind of like analysis or modeling.
Right, but
we need to keep moving on.
Okay, I was warming up on that one. Okay, I'm just going to say that, like as Chris says, the lagoon system on Bay Farm and Alameda are actually a great precedent for how you might adapt other areas for groundwater rise.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lagoons, they could be good. So this is the last bit that I'm going to talk about here, and it's that we can't always think about these hazards separately because often multiple hazards happen together, and we've seen this in 2023, and they can also happen in back-to-back events, and we have seen this in 2023. And so compound flooding happens when we have multiple hazards happening at the same time, or when they happen back-to-back. And then future hazards, future storms are really reducing the ability of our systems to adapt and mitigate flooding. So we want to consider them all together. So this kind of is just a series that just kind of shows you from really a structural perspective, primarily how we could adapt the shoreline over time to deal with some of these compound flood risks. And so we already talked about how rising seas could drive that coastal flooding inland. And you could build that flood defense, build a flood wall to try and like keep the bay out. So we can raise that shoreline. But then when it's raining, we start getting that higher groundwater table. This is just creating that condition of a bathtub. So this is what we don't want to have happen. This would be called maladaptation. So we could add more pump stations. And so we're taking that rain and that groundwater that are starting to flood areas and we are pumping it back into the bay. Kind of a feedback loop, but with enough pumping. You may have some temporary getting wet, but we can get the water back out of the developed areas. And this creates kind of that two interconnected flood zones. You've got like a coastal flood zone and an inland flood zone, and they are going to be like kind of tightly managed together. I was going to say, we can also like here do other physical interventions. You know, we can think about our tolerance to get wet and flood-proof structures. It's a very, you know, US kind of centric thing to not want any buildings to get wet. We can flood-proof to minimize damage during flooding. We can also relocate structures out of really high-risk flood-prone areas, especially if they're getting repetitively damaged. I think it's always a good idea for us to think about like multiple ways to address the problem, so we're not relying on like just one solution. So you'll see a lot of, when we start bringing out more adaptation concepts, it's not just going to be physical structures, but kind of a range of other solutions and policy changes likely as well. So I believe this is another word cloud prompt for you guys to put in the chat about what flood hazard concerns you the most. Doesn't have to be specifically a flood hazard, what type of flooding, any specific locations you're worried about the most, but yeah, you guys could add responses to the chat about your concerns when it comes to thinking about flooding in your neighborhood, where you live, work, or play. We would love to get your feedback in the chat. Jamie, you can see the chat, so you can.
Yeah. Yeah, people are concerned about the inland flooding, the flooding in their neighborhoods like Bay Farm Island, North Shore, and Doolittle Drive, subsidence, which happens after you start pumping the groundwater out, the ground subsides, and so then you're actually lower than you were.
Yeah.
Groundwater, destabilization of building foundations, concerned about how lower income residents will be affected by inland flooding, impact on homes. Someone's mentioning liquefaction. Yep, the rising groundwater, more water makes the liquefaction concern during earthquakes worse. Toxic waste rising due to groundwater intrusion.
Yeah, the challenges of dealing with not just rising groundwater, but also sea level rise, inundation, all of these hazards with the water cycle interacting with legacy contaminated sites all around the bay is a topic of huge interest. You know, from communities that live near toxic sites, also from the Regional Water Control Board and the Department of Toxic Substance Control at the EPA have been trying to develop regulations to get out in front of this problem. But there is still so much we don't know about how rising groundwater could mobilize contaminants, what contaminants are at the greatest risk of mobilization, you know, which ones could cause unintended health impacts to people and the environment. So it's definitely something that we're going to have to keep an eye on as adaptation plans go forward. And it's not just in the Oakland Alameda area, it's all around the Bay Area, and it's really all along our coastlines. We built landfills all along the coastline of the Bay and like the Pacific coast. That's where we dumped our garbage and toxic waste, and did lots of very irresponsible things because the Bay didn't used to be valued. It was a good garbage dump, but we really changed how we feel about the Bay and natural environments, which is a great thing, but we're left with a legacy of pollution around the Bay.
Okay, great. I think we're running a little bit behind, Chris, so we need to keep going. Just to introduce the next section, part 2 is about a response to the changing climate. We used part 1 to tell you all of the hazards and the problems that we're going to be trying to solve. And I just want to emphasize that we're talking about sea level rise, inland flooding, rising groundwater, because these are the primary issues in the Oakland Alameda region. And now to respond to those issues, we're going to go through a series of adaptation, like a toolkit, and then adaptation pathways. And then after this section, we're going to leave this room and go into a breakout room where we can have a discussion and answer questions together in about groups of 10. So it's 7:05 now, so we need to be heading into those groups by at least 7:15, I think. So here we go. Just to show you some examples of what we can do to adapt to rising sea level rise. There are these structural or engineering solutions. And so here's one, a seawall. Next slide. This is a seawall at Jack London. This is a levee with a seawall. This is the newly built levee at Foster City. It has a bay trail on the top of it. And so seawalls and levees are one piece of the protection method where they would be part of the structure that helps to protect from sea level rise. But then we want to layer in other things. And so the next slide actually is also just showing you the pumps, as Chris May talked about, that as we build the wall along the edge, we create this problem where we're trapping water behind the wall or levee as well, and we need to be able to pump that out. So kind of that suite of engineering is probably going to be part of our solution, but we don't want it to be the entire solution necessarily because of the long range work we need to do here. So next slide. So these levees and seawalls can be incorporated into shoreline improvements and waterfront parks along the shoreline so that access and connection to the bay can be maintained. And so this is the part of the levee at Alameda Point, which has a sort of urban waterfront park built on top of the levee. Next slide. The improvements can be parks in open space that are more natural looking and more and providing co-benefits through nature-based solutions. Next slide. The levee and the protection can be incorporated with waterfront parks that also provide water access, gravel beaches, sand beaches, where people can get down to the water, but also having these rocks along the edges. The next slide shows the opportunity for rocky intertidal habitat, which also provides a lot of benefit to everybody living in the water. And Crane Cove there on the left side is a new gravel beach and rocky intertidal habitat in San Francisco that you could visit. Next slide. And then Heron's Head Marsh is a really great example of public access and shoreline protection, but it also has, next slide, the whole suite of kind of nature-based solution and waterside native habitats that we could use as part of our adaptation strategies as we protect the inland sides along the shoreline. And so this is the suite, and there's more than this, but this is just to give you a sense of the collection of pieces that we'll be need to put together to protect all the way along the coastlines for Oakland and Alameda. And there are more than this as well, but this is a starting point for all of us. Next.
All right, I will try to talk quickly about adaptation pathways because as you saw, we're planning for a lot of uncertainty and we can't just sit and wait to get greater uncertainty, but we are developing adaptation pathways that are going to require actions made over multiple generations. So we want to look at incremental adaptation decisions or actions over time that consider, the long-term plan considers higher end projections of what is plausible. We're not going to probably nail that down to a single solution because other generations are going to have to provide their input. We're identifying near-term actions to address existing risks and likely projections. And then we're identifying triggers and thresholds of how we're going to change these things over time. So just as an example, we often break this down into shoreline reaches to look at areas of similar characteristics, height, adaptation potential. And then we drill in and look at what is the near-term adaptation and what are pathways to the future. Obviously, you're not going to design adaptation for each reach independently. They're connected, but you're often going to have like opportunities for nature-based versus going more gray or hybrid, and you're also stitching them together into an alternative. But if we start looking at an adaptation pathway, the pathway is going to include the actions that we're implementing. So my action is I'm going to do this initial action for this ecotone habitat levee along the shoreline. But it is going to come with adding public access. It is going to come with, other actions of adopting flood resilient building codes, floodproofing structures, building new resilient structures, relocating some structures, and lots of other policy changes. But for simplicity, I'm just going to focus on like the actions that we're talking about on the shoreline. So maybe step one, we can all agree today that we want nature-based solutions, and we're going to implement this habitat kind of levee shoreline solution with the Bay Trail. But then if sea level rise continues to rise, maybe that next action turns to a gray feature, and they are adding a small flood well with an oversized foundation so they can upgrade it later. We start to lose our habitat protection, habitat-driven protection. And if sea level rise continue to rise, you can double down and build that wall higher. Now you're losing the sight lines for that little person. You're also the Ps, or you're building pump stations to deal with the inland flooding. But this is like one potential pathway that future generations can take, because we are going to lay out pathways, but other people are going to be making decisions for that second and third step along a pathway. But we can also do, like, future generations may decide that they really liked what we did and they want to continue building on the ecotone habitat structures. So as sea level rise continues to rise, we don't want to mess up the habitat that is already there. It's going to need protection. So we build up and we move inland as we try to increase the amount of habitat levee and go to a higher ecotone. So this could require removing some structures or raising structures to help alleviate inland flooding and the need for more pump stations. And then as we go to step 3, we kind of go to like more nature-based solutions, raised structures, but this is kind of keeping it much more in a green spectrum. And we want to look at all these types of different permutations that the future could take. We're not going to necessarily decide on what that solution at 2100 is, but we don't want to nail ourselves down to minimize options. So this adaptation pathway, step 1, we all liked green. And then there's probably different permutations of all nature-based or all gray or green and gray combined together over time. And understanding all of the different policy solutions and solutions for inland and ground flooding, so we can set up future generations to have a good dialogue and make decisions. And hopefully, maybe we can lay out the preferred path, but it's always hard to know. I can't tell my children what to do, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to impart in them that when they're adults, they're going to implement this plan exactly as we have laid it out. Our near-term actions are going to be much more certain. And then we're just kind of laying things out to consider the trade-offs for green and gray in the future, and hopefully encourage dialogue and transparent decision making that is equity centered for all of our communities. And I know we want to get to breakouts, so we might just skip this. We're looking at the whole range of things from protect to accommodate, retreat, and avoid. They all go together. And I think a big thing is getting our heads in the right space, that we want to move towards transformative adaptation. We want to avoid holding the line or sticking in our mentality of like not allowing ourselves to be wet and resisting change. We want to go through this spectrum to really be open-minded on how we can transform our communities and create resilience. So we have a quick word cloud about adaptation ideas that you are excited about. Maybe people can put responses in the chat while we start moving into breakout groups.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Lightning pathways. It's not going to happen that fast, but yeah, we wanted to give you an introduction to all the pieces that we have as we are starting these projects now, and we're going to be working on them for generations to come. Keita's excited about a waterfront park. Restoring habitat, wetlands.
No, just kidding.
Yeah. Habitats, wetlands, more wetland parks like Deep Haven at Alameda Point, public access, transition to wetlands, managed retreats. Yes, we all need to be talking about that.
Absolutely.
please keep putting that in the chat. We're going to grab them. And just to tell you what's going to happen next, Victor is going to move us into breakout rooms. There'll be a facilitator and a note taker in each room. And you can ask questions about any part of the presentation and talk about it. And then we'll come back here at about 7:27 and in 10 minutes to close.